June 1940, France was on its knees. The German offensive began on May 10th. Less than 5 weeks later, on June 14th, the Nazis took Paris. Germany had defeated the French army, reputed to be the best in the world in the wake of the Great War. But this was a new lightning tactic, blitzkrieg.
By mid-June, the situation was desperate for the French. The Germans took Paris on the 14th. 3 days later, the French lines of defense had completely collapsed. There was no coherent defense.
The Germans went much further than they had anticipated in 6 very intense weeks, quickly forcing France to ask for an armistice.
On June 17th, Marshal Pétain addressed the nation.
Français, j'assume à partir d'aujourd'hui la direction du gouvernement de la France. C'est le cœur serré que je vous dise aujourd'hui qu'il faut cesser le combat.
It was a terrible shock to hear this trembling voice tell the French that all hope was lost, that we had to lay down our arms, that we had to cozy up with Mr. Hitler, the sworn enemy of France, who had promised to annihilate France. I thought, this is not possible. This is just not possible.
Through his request for an armistice, Marshal Pétain hoped to halt the Germans' rapid advance. But until the agreement was signed, Nazi troops continued their progress towards the Atlantic coast. In just 5 days, they almost doubled the territory they controlled.
Before concluding the armistice, the Germans wanted to take control of certain areas. The war against Britain was not yet won, and so the Atlantic coast and the English Channel were strategic points for Germany. The German units were even competing to see who could reach the Atlantic coast first.
Between the moment when the tanks reached Rennes and the moment when they arrived at the gates of Brest, only 48 hours elapsed, so they were moving extremely fast.
German forces were racing to the Atlantic to take up positions to attack the British. In the major French ports of Lorient, Brest, and Cherbourg, there was panic. It was out of the question that the French fleet would fall into enemy hands. Admiral Darlon, who had commanded the French fleet since 1937, gave the order for these naval bases to be evacuated as quickly as possible. All the French battleships fled towards North Africa and Britain.
They left nothing. The plans of the ships were destroyed. Anything which could be used by the Germans was destroyed.
It's hard to imagine this incredible maritime exodus. Anything that floated, even with difficulty, or which could be towed, was put out of reach of the Germans.
The Germans fired on the fleeing ships, but they were already at some distance, so the losses were limited.
Among the French vessels forced to flee were 3 submarines, 3 very effective vessels, and a formidable threat to the enemy: the Junot, the Manurv, and the Surcouf. The Junot and the Manurv were similar vessels with a length of 68 meters and capable of diving to a depth of 80 meters. They were modern submarines with a discrete profile equipped with 9 torpedo tubes. The Surcouf was on a different scale. With a length of 110 meters, it was the only submarine armed with large caliber artillery. It could even carry a seaplane.
At the time, the Surcouf was the biggest submarine in the world. It was a prestige vessel for the French Navy, which was very proud of the Surcouf. It was therefore unthinkable to leave it for the Germans.
Most of the ships from the Atlantic coast sought refuge in the colonial ports in North Africa. But the 3 submarines would have a very different destiny. When the order came through to flee, they were being repaired in the French ports. They were not in good enough shape to make that long crossing. The only destination possible was Britain. They struggled to cross the channel to reach Plymouth, the nearest port. It was through this quirk of fate that the Surcouf, the Junot, and the Manurv found themselves on the side of the British Allies in June 1940. It was a stroke of fate that would change the course of history. A 4th French submarine had already been stationed in Britain since May 1940. The French had made it available to the British in the war against German shipping in the North Sea. This was the Rubis.
The particularity of the Rubis was that it was a mine-laying submarine, and it was lighter than its British counterparts.
With a length of 66 meters and a beam of 7 meters, the Rubis was a fairly small submarine. It carried 32 mines in 16 vertical shafts, 8 on each side. Like all submarines, it was also armed with torpedoes, 2 in the bow and 2 astern. It was propelled by diesel engines when on the surface and electric motors when underwater, which meant the time the submarine could spend immersed was limited. When the batteries were empty, it had to resurface to recharge them.
The problem with the submarine was that it had to resurface very often, which made them vulnerable for that time when it was exposed and visible to all. A submarine is not designed to be on the surface, and so if there is a boat or plane nearby, it's very dangerous to be there. So that was a constraint on the use of these vessels.
Beneath the waves, a submarine navigates in 3 dimensions like an aircraft. The diving planes work in conjunction with the rudders, allowing the vessel to be steered. The ballast tanks allow it to dive and resurface. They are filled with water to descend, and the water is driven out by compressed air to resurface. The periscope allows the crew to observe what is happening on the surface while remaining at a depth of around 12 meters. In the depths of the ocean, when it is impossible to use the periscope, the vessel has 0 visibility. This means one of the key posts on board any submarine is the radio operator. Roger Guillaumet is familiar with the living space on these vessels. His father served on board the Rubis. He acted as the submarine's ears, a vital role.
My father was then the petty officer in charge of the radio on the Rubis. On top of that, he was also in charge of listening on board the submarine. When the submarine is submerged, it is completely blind. So they have to listen using sonar equipment on the hull to try to understand their environment.
A well-trained radio operator can distinguish between the sound of the propeller on a commercial ship and that of a warship. And he can tell the direction of travel and distance of the source of the sound. Between the officers, seamen, torpedo operators, mechanics, and cooks, the crew comprised 44 men. The Rubis, the Manurv, the Juno, and the Surcouf, which were all in Britain in June 1940, found themselves in a delicate position. Following the armistice, no one knew what would happen to them. Would they be scuttled, disarmed, or handed over to the Germans? Or would they continue to fight? One man in London realized that these submarines could be a major asset in the struggle against the Nazis, General de Gaulle. Undersecretary in the government of Paul Reynaud and charged with liaison with the British Allies, Charles de Gaulle left France when Marshal Pétain took power. De Gaulle arrived in London on June 17th. The following day, he addressed the French on the BBC in what became known as the Appeal of June 18th.
Moi, Général de Gaulle, j'invite tous les Français qui veulent rester libres à se réunir à moi et à me suivre.
The political context behind the appeal of the 18th of June is one of resistance. The idea was that France had been effectively defeated, but nonetheless, it wasn't definitively down and out.
Jacques Le Gall was one of those men who refused to admit defeat.
In June 1940, I lived in the small but very busy port of Audierne, just near the Île-de-Saint. I was the eldest of 4 boys. I had decided to become a naval officer. So I was preparing to sit the Navy School entrance exams. So it was quite natural. I was a good patriot, and I only aspired to one thing, to serve my country and fight for it.
In the middle of his test to enter naval school, the fate of Jacques Le Gall, then aged 18, changed forever.
They suddenly announced that the tests were cancelled. The situation was catastrophic. The Germans were advancing at lightning speed. I thought, this isn't possible. It can't all end like this. We still have huge potential. I went to find my mother, and I told her I'd taken the decision to leave. I was sure that the war wasn't over and that we had to fight. She told me she had expected this reaction, and she gave me her blessing. And my younger brother, who was 17 and who was standing next to me, said, "I'm coming with you."
Like 900 other civilians, the Gaulle brothers decided to leave for the unknown. They took 2 days to find a boat that was leaving their Brittany village, heading for Britain. They went off to war.
I saw Audierne disappearing into the mist, and I thought, will I ever see it again one day? But we had to go.
This course of action today seems quite rational because history has proved them right. But at the time, it seemed, if not foolish, certainly an extraordinary step.
On June 22nd, the armistice between France and Germany was signed in Compiègne. General de Gaulle repeated his appeal.
Nous croyons que l'honneur des Français consiste à continuer la guerre aux côtés de leurs alliés, et nous sommes résolus à le faire.
But the French Navy did not answer the call. It chose to stick with Pétain's government.
The explanation for why the Navy finally went in favor of obeying Marshal Pétain's orders was the terms of the armistice, since under its conditions the naval apparatus was preserved.
The Germans made it clear that they would not touch the fleet. It would just be demobilized in port, so it could not fight against Germany.
The French Navy was muzzled, but among its ranks, some brave men would rebel. When Italy joined the war on June 10, 1940, the French fleet had to concentrate on the defense of the Mediterranean. The submarine Narval was sent to Sousse in Tunisia. This 78-meter-long vessel had a crew of 48, under the command of Captain François Drogout. Outraged by Pétain's collaboration with the Nazis, Drogout found himself faced with a dilemma: follow orders or join the resistance. His daughter, Mitou Drogout, still has the letters her father wrote to her mother in June 1940.
You have given me the sweetest love and the most beautiful children. I have to choose between us and my country. I choose my country. When the armistice was announced, he made up his mind. On the 18th of June, he wrote to his wife, "I'm leaving. That's all I know. I also know that neither you nor our children will feel any shame towards their father from now on. I'm setting aside all other considerations. I am fighting on until the end of the war." I remember that day when he left. We saw him go because we had an apartment which looked out over the port, and we saw the Narval leaving.
On June 23rd at 11:30 p.m., François Drogout left Tunisia on board the Narval. Along with his crew, he was going to join the British forces.
He was breaching orders. He had no right to do that. It was Drogout's own initiative to leave with his crew. What's more, he was recalled. They sent him counter-orders telling him to return to Sousse immediately, and he refused to obey.
When everybody else is conforming to be the one that says, I'm going to go in a different direction, and as an aside, I'm going to go in a different direction and continue to risk my life, when actually I could do what everybody else is doing and be a bit safer. To take that decision, I think, is incredible.
Through this insubordination, Drogout knew that he risked a court-martial for high treason, but he stuck to his plan.
He then issued his message, which became famous: "Treason across the board. I'm heading for an English port."
These few words went down in history. This was the first manifestation of a French naval force resisting. This message signaled to the rest of the French Navy that the Narval refused to obey Pétain's orders and informed the British it was switching sides. But the Narval received no reply. Nonetheless, Drogo headed for the nearest British-controlled port, which was on the Mediterranean island of Malta. But the French submarine did not get the welcome it was hoping for.
The problem for Drogo on the Narval, and he quickly realized this when he approached Malta, was that France was no longer fighting alongside Britain, and therefore it was considered as a potential enemy. And when Drogo arrived off the coast of Malta, he encountered a destroyer, the Diamond, whose crew wondered what this submarine was doing there and what attitude they should adopt.
Et l'attitude qu'il doit adopter vis-à-vis de ce sous-marin.
When the British ships saw the Narval arrive, it considered it an intruder and put its guns in position to attack. On board the Narval, they were desperately looking for a solution to avoid a confrontation. Drogo sent a message explaining that they were there to join them. The lives of the whole crew were at stake.
But what Drogo was saying to the Diamond was simply incomprehensible to the crew of the British ship.
The message was coded according to the old system that the British and French used before the armistice. It had been replaced just 24 hours earlier. If it could not make itself understood by the British battleship, the French submarine could be sunk by the ally it was trying to join. The tension was at a peak.
Everything was happening at an urgent pace, which explains why the situation was extremely tense.
At the last moment, an officer on board the British ship found the previous codes and managed to decipher Drogo's message. The British let the Narval pass, and the French crew could draw breath. But the time had not yet come to engage with the German enemy. The British were not yet done with the French Navy.
If the French fleet fell into German hands, it would represent a grave threat to Britain, as Churchill was well aware.
To prevent this, a major operation was launched on the 3rd of July 1940, which aimed to neutralize French ships in Britain and North Africa.
During Operation Catapult, the British seized many of the vessels in the French Navy. Its culmination was the attack on Mers el-Kébir, which saw the destruction of a large part of the French fleet, which had sought refuge in the Algerian port.
Mers el-Kébir was not really a battle. It lasted 20 minutes, and in 20 minutes, several vessels were rendered unfit for combat.
And there is a bloodbath. One of the French battleships explodes and sinks. The loss of life is absolutely horrendous. And for the first time, the British and the French are firing on each other when they've been allies just a few days before.
1,300 French sailors died at Mers el-Kébir. In England, many others were taken to prison camps. Against such a dramatic backdrop, what would be the fate of General de Gaulle's submarines? In Malta, the Narval felt the full force of Operation Catapult. While the French crew was on land, British officers took the vessel by force.
Captain Drogo was stupefied to see how Operation Catapult was unfolding in Malta. He arrived with his crew to join the fight alongside the British, and what did the British do? They started by seizing his submarine.
This British intrusion came as a shock for the sailors on the Narval. Drogo protested and demanded an apology from the British, who complied. But the trust had been broken. Many of the crew now refused to fight on the British side. Drogo summoned his men.
He gave them the choice to go or to stay.
Half of Drogo's men decided to return to France, and some rejoined Pétain's navy. But without a full crew, the Narval could not put to sea. So Drogo's first mission was to recruit sailors to go into combat with him. At the same time, in the Scottish port of Dundee, the crew of the Rubis were also facing this crucial choice: falling in line with the demobilized navy under Pétain, or carrying on the fight alongside the Allies and General de Gaulle. This decision would have major consequences. The sailors took a vote to decide the fate of the Rubis.
I think it was a collective decision. They discussed it, then voted on pieces of paper to see who wanted to continue the war. And 42 men out of 44 voted to continue the war, so it was a very decisive outcome.
The result of the vote was unexpected. Despite the shock of Mirs el-Kebir, on board the Rubis, the choice to carry on fighting was almost unanimous.
I think they could not bear the idea of the armistice, which for them was utterly abominable, a kind of betrayal, so they had to continue the war.
One of the reasons for the determination among the Rubis' crew was that before the armistice in May 1940, it had already carried out 4 missions against the Germans alongside the British. Facing the enemy together had forged a bond between the crew.
My father really loved the Rubis. I think it was like a big family. It was an effective combat unit, and there was no question of allowing this combat unit with its highly trained crew to fall into enemy hands or to be disarmed.
The crew of the Rubis were ready to take on the Nazis. But to do this, they needed a command structure to draw up a strategy for this new force and to integrate new French volunteers who had managed to reach Britain. This task fell to General de Gaulle, but his leadership had been severely shaken by Operation Catapult, and it would take him several days to reassert control over his troops.
We arrived in London. We were due to see de Gaulle on the 3rd of July. And he arrived on the 6th. And when we saw him, he was extremely pale, no trace of a smile, his face taut.
General de Gaulle had good reason to be worried. The vast majority of the French army remained loyal to Pétain's France. He found himself in charge of some 2,000 soldiers prepared to continue the war, plus some totally inexperienced civilians.
There were barely 900 civilians from across France. And among those 900 civilians, 3/4 of them were youths. Anyone else but him would have thrown in the towel, but he stood firm and carried on, and on, and on.
On June 10th, de Gaulle declared the formation of a French government in exile with its own armed force. The Free French Forces were born. One of its most strategic assets was its navy, which was known as the Free French Naval Forces.
The creation of these Free French Forces showed that France was capable of continuing the fight, despite having declared an armistice.
Within this naval force that defected from the Vichy regime, the submarines were significant assets.
Für U-Boote ist es immer relativ einfach, sie auch wieder einzusetzen.
Since they operate autonomously, submarines are relatively simple to mobilize. They just need a mission and a defined target. So these were the first French vessels deployed on the side of the British.
There are 5 Free French submarines, which doesn't sound very many, but actually their impact as a symbol of the continuing alliance is really important.
General de Gaulle was a great strategist for land forces, but he was not familiar with the Navy. Fortunately, among those officers who rallied to him was an admiral, Émile Muselier, who arrived in London on June 30th, 1940.
Admiral Muselier was quite an exceptional figure in the French Navy. He'd fought in the First World War, so he was not someone readily resigned to defeat, and who had not accepted that combat was over, and who considered that as long as there were sailors capable of fighting, they should continue fighting, even with the British.
Admiral Muselier persuaded the British to hand back to the French some of the vessels they had seized during Operation Catapult. Among these were 3 submarines, the Surcouf, the Manurv, and the Junon. He recruited crews and set up a naval school to train the young men who had come to fight, like Jacques Le Gall.
One thing he did for the Free France vessels was make sure they could be differentiated. So they could be recognized as fighting against the Germans. They were given their own insignia.
Admiral Muselier came from the Lorraine, and it was he who chose the Cross of Lorraine as a tribute to his home region.
The Cross of Lorraine was just a symbol on the flag of Free French Naval Forces ships. But it quickly became the emblem of Free France, and then came to represent the resistance. It's a symbol that's very easy to draw, much simpler than writing Vive de Gaulle on a wall.
The Free French Naval Forces now had a flag, a school for volunteers, and a fleet, including 5 valuable submarines. The Narval, based in Malta, the Rubis in Dundee, the Jeunot, the Surcouf, and the Manurv in Plymouth. These vessels now had to prove their worth in a war that was being largely played out at sea.
One of the reasons why it's important to have a free French Navy, and one of the reasons why the Royal Navy is so important, is the Second World War is entirely a sea war. So the pivotal battle for the Western Allies is the Battle of the Atlantic, which is the battle to secure the supply lines across from North America, from the USA and Canada, to the UK.
It was extremely important to supply the front in terms of men, equipment and provisions. So it was a fundamental element in a total war on a global scale.
Supplies were a crucial factor. For the Allies, much of this came in the form of transatlantic convoys, several ships sailing under the protection of armed escorts.
The German submarines were the main threat in the Battle of the Atlantic.
The Germans had understood the effectiveness of submarines for sinking Allied convoys. At the end of the 1930s, they had built up a formidable naval force in which U-boats played a key role.
The Germans deploy a submarine fleet, the U-boat fleet, immensely powerful, never quite powerful enough to try and cut that bridge across the Atlantic. They deploy surface ships, powerful warships like the Bismarck that go out there, and those warships and submarines, their sole job is to sink merchant ships.
German destroyers would become the preferred prey of the submarines of Free France. On board the Narval, François Drogu was heading out for his first mission in the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, in Plymouth, Jacques Le Gall, the young Breton sailor, embarked on the Manurv.
I joined the Manurv on the 10th of October 1940. The Manurv was in Plymouth. I had my papers, I arrived on board, and the boat was magnificent.
The Manurv was very modern for its time. The French submarines were built between the wars. Many vessels dated from the 1920s. But the Manurv went into service just before the war. It was one of the most modern submarines in the French Navy.
I presented myself and they took me down into the boat. And it was in an incredible mess. I had to step over pipes and things. There was stuff everywhere.
The young sailor would have to learn to tame this monster of technology. The Manurv was a submarine weighing 600 tons, armed with 6 torpedoes and with a crew of 38 men. It could dive to a depth of 80 meters with an additional margin of 40 meters. It could dive in 45 seconds, a record at the time. Its mission was to hunt down the big battleships the Germans had stationed in the Norwegian ports, which the Nazis had occupied in April 1940. On April 2, 1941, the Manurv sailed to Scapa Flow in Scotland before leaving the submarine base there for Norway. The submarine and its crew were about to carry out an exploit that would become the stuff of legend.
On the second or third day, I don't remember which, a large ship came into view, an oil tanker of some 10,000 tons, escorted by 2 ships and 2 planes.
This was a choice target for the Free French forces, since destroying an oil tanker would hamper the Nazi supply lines. But the maneuver was very risky for this young crew. If the submarine was spotted by the enemy, it could be sunk. Nonetheless, they did not hesitate to make their attack. The opportunity was too good to miss.
So we attacked, firing 2 torpedoes.
Once the torpedo has left the vessel, it's on its way. It has a little motor, often powered by a battery, which turns a propeller just like a boat.
The torpedoes had been fired, but the submarine was now in great danger.
There was a huge boom. A big cheer went up on board, but the second officer responsible for putting the sub in dive mode reacted too slowly after the 2 torpedoes had been launched.
When you launch a torpedo, several things happen. The torpedo heads off and leaves the vessel, so you have a little weight problem because you've got a weapon weighing several hundred kilos which leaves the ship, so you have to compensate for that.
On the Manurv that day, the officer responsible for diving underestimated the weight of the torpedoes with grave consequences.
He completely messed up the maneuver because we broke the surface. And we really surfaced a lot, since the top of the handrail came out of the water.
A submarine's only protection is to remain unseen. By partially emerging from the water, the Manurv had revealed its position to the enemy escorts accompanying the tanker. The Manurv had to dive urgently to be out of reach of enemy fire.
Luckily, the seabed was not too far down, because I'm not sure we'd have stopped otherwise. In the end, we touched the bottom at 45 or 50 meters.
But that did not mean the sailors were safe. Having broken the surface, the Manurv had been spotted by the escorts. The enemy ships positioned themselves just above the submarine and began dropping depth charges into the sea.
Depth charges are bombs that are dropped over the side of a boat. They explode at a preset depth, and if you're lucky and you hit a submarine, you can destroy it.
The crew of the Manurv had no choice but to stay still on the seabed, praying that none of the depth charges would impact the submarine.
We came under depth charge attack. It was the first time, and it was absolutely terrifying.
The crew waited desperately for the enemy to give up, but this waiting game could have proved fatal.
Once it has dived, the vessel is immobile. There's no air conditioning, of course, and so it can only operate until the oxygen runs out. It has to resurface when there's none left. Otherwise, the crew will die of asphyxiation.
For 13 hours, Jacques Le Gall and his crewmates remained stuck at the bottom of the North Sea. In total, some 27 depth charges exploded around them.
The boat was badly damaged. Lots of things were broken. Fortunately, nobody lost it, because sometimes the emotion is so great that people crack up. It was awful. It really was a miraculous escape. That's not too strong a word for it. Mentally, we were very strong. We didn't want to give up. No one wanted to give in to the pain or the effort. But it was often a struggle against the extremes, the physical limits, the nervous limits.
Exhausted by this attack, the sailors on the Manurv could take pride in having disrupted the Nazi supply lines. Aside from these moments of extreme tension, day-to-day living conditions for the submariners were very tough.
We didn't have enough bunks for all the men. There were 2 bunks for 3 men, which meant when one man left his bunk to go on watch, he was replaced by another shipmate. If it was a mechanic, the poor guy would be covered in grease. If it was a seaman who'd been on deck, he'd arrive completely soaked.
There was one toilet for the whole crew, in other words, for 44 men. There was no water, so they couldn't wash. They lived in absolutely terrible conditions. It was damp, the air was always saturated, so everything was dripping wet on board.
We could literally see the water running down the interior of the boat. Icy water, which rotted and ate into everything. It was abominable.
After learning the ropes, Jacques Le Gall became a second officer on the Manurv. He assisted the officers and took care of the sailors' health. This was a difficult task, given the deplorable hygiene conditions. Wounds would become infected, leaving many with boils.
The damp, mouldy conditions encouraged this. It's sad to say, but it attracted all sorts of parasites. Rats thrived on board. Not to mention cockroaches. There were cockroaches everywhere.
The omnipresent moisture even got into the food.
You set sail with just canned food. And sea biscuits, which were practically inedible. They were in cans that were supposedly watertight, but which were anything but, so most of the time the biscuits were mouldy.
After spending several weeks in these terrible conditions, the sailors only wanted one thing: to get back onto dry land. Back at their base in Dundee, the men enjoyed a well-earned break while the machinery was inspected and repaired. For the Manurv, and for the other Free France submarines stationed in Britain, this period of patching up was another source of problems, this time of a technical nature.
One of the challenges was finding parts to repair them. They didn't have any parts because those submarines were of a different design to the British submarines, so the parts weren't compatible.
And the most obvious example I can give is that France is a country that uses the metric system and Britain is a country that doesn't. So even screws and bolts and nuts are not compatible.
In the case of the Manurv, the engineers had to go as far as designing motors to fit. Once the submarines were repaired, the Free France sailors were ready to head out on another mission, from which they could never be sure they would return. All of them were haunted by a terrible tragedy which took place 6 months earlier. December 1941. Since its engagement in the Free French Forces, the Narval had carried out several missions in the Mediterranean under British command. On December 2nd, it headed out on patrol. On the 16th, when it was due to return, there was no sign of the Narval. The Admiralty had no idea what had happened. On December 21st, it was declared lost at sea. François Drogoux and his men were presumed entombed within the sub.
I was 5.5 when he died.
It was during its second mission that the Narval disappeared, probably after striking a mine. In 1957, they found the wreck of the Narval, which was lost with all hands.
The Narval had 50 sailors, with an average age of 22. They were all volunteers, ready to lay down their lives for the honor of France. The youngest wasn't yet 18. They wanted to hold a mass for the loss of the Narval, but the church refused because they considered the Narval was crewed by families of traitors. The families of free French sailors who died in action did not receive death pensions. The Vichy regime considered that sailors who joined the Free French Forces were at best deserters, at worst traitors. I was lucky enough to have known my father. I'm lucky to have the diary he wrote for my mother in 1940, which explains the reasons for his decision. That was a gift for my 21st birthday, reading my father's diary.
Captain Drogu, who had bravely chosen to continue fighting the Nazis, died along with all his crew. The Narval, the first submarine to have answered de Gaulle's call, had been sunk. Despite the loss of the Narval, the submarines of Free France were so fiercely engaged in the struggle against the Nazis that they sometimes took huge risks. In the case of the Rubis, such action nearly cost it dearly. On August 18, 1941, it headed out to lay mines off the port of Stavanger in Norway. The Germans were especially vulnerable here, since their cargo vessels emerged from the string of islands that protected them into open water.
The sure way to inflict damage on the enemy was to lay mines in narrow stretches where the German shipping had to pass.
The Rubis went out on its mission on the 18th of August 1941 under the command of Captain Rousselot, and it came across a convoy of 2 cargo ships with 2 escorts.
The Rubis found itself facing the Hogland, a Finnish oil tanker flying the German flag, accompanied by 2 escort vessels. The crew of the Rubis wanted to seize the opportunity.
When you spot an enemy ship, you position yourself opposite it and calculate the speed of the oncoming ship and the speed of the torpedo.
They were in a favorable position for firing, and so they launched 2 torpedoes. One torpedo hit the target after 7 seconds. The other after 10 seconds. They were there to inflict harm on the Germans. They were at war, so they had to kill the enemy.
It fired its 2 torpedoes. It was 800 meters away, and with the tanker approaching, the torpedoes exploded at less than 300 meters from the Rubis.
300 meters meant the Rubis was much too close to its target. The blast from the explosion was a grave danger for the submarine and its crew.
The problem with this attack is that when you fire a torpedo, it doesn't work by penetrating the hull of the ship and exploding inside. A torpedo destroys a ship by exploding under it, creating a blast bubble which breaks the ship's superstructure, breaking its keel in 2, which then sinks it.
The target was hit, the tanker sank. But this victory came at a price. The torpedo's blast had damaged the Rubis, and its batteries no longer worked. How would the crew get out of this perilous situation? After several hours of tricky maneuvers, the Rubis finally resurfaced. But now it faced a new problem. It could no longer dive. The submarine was vulnerable to attack from German aircraft which were patrolling the area. The Rubis sent an SOS to the British command.
They managed to send a message to give their location. I can well remember my father recounting how they had to save enough battery life to send this message, because they also needed electric power. And they managed to send that message to report their situation.
The British immediately responded to the Rubis' message and sent a task force to rescue the stricken submarine. 3 planes and 8 ships headed out to save the Rubis on a high-risk mission.
The problem was there was a minefield between the fleet of surface ships and the Rubis.
So the Rubis had to head for the exit of the minefield, where it was met by the cruiser Curaçao, the destroyers, and a tug. In the end, they made it.
The British escorts accompanied the Rubis back to its base in Dundee. The crew had never been so happy to see the Scottish coast. They returned victorious.
It was a symbol that they wanted to bring home in one piece. They could have rescued the men by seaplane and brought them back to Dundee, leaving the Rubis to sink.
The British decorated them for this mission.
On October 14, 1941, Charles de Gaulle awarded the Cross of Liberation to the Rubis. This was Free France's highest honor, created to reward courageous action by men and women who fought under its banner.
There were only 3 Navy units which were companions of the liberation, and there was 1 submarine among them. That goes to show the role these submarines played.
The fact that the British deployed considerable resources to save the Rubis reveals how much General de Gaulle's position had changed. From a desperate situation and practically no forces in 1940, the Free French forces had earned their place among the Allied forces.
And that's the weird, the full circle has turned then, and France is a full player in the alliance again. Without the Free French Navy to keep that spirit going, it's doubtful that would have happened.
The situation was now changing rapidly. On December 7, 1941, the Americans joined the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor, which came as good news for the British.
Churchill greets this with a huge sigh of relief, because from that point on, the war cannot be lost once the USA is in it.
The war was now a truly global conflict. It was no longer being played out only in the Atlantic, but also in the Pacific. To play a part in this new theater, the Free French Army sent its best submarine, the Surcouf. Unfortunately, it would never arrive in Sydney. It sank along the way on February 19, 1942, after a collision with an American cargo ship.
It sank without trace, with the loss of all hands. It was a tragic fate for the Surcouf, a sad end. That incident remains a record. 130 victims. Never have more people died in a submarine accident.
In a year and a half, de Gaulle had lost 2 of his 5 submarines, the Narval and the Surcouf. The other 3, the Junon, the Manurv, and the Rubis, continued to fight on. And the danger was not always where they expected it. In October 1943, the Manurv took to sea, heading for the Mediterranean to hunt down and sink enemy shipping. Its route took it through the English Channel, an extremely dangerous stretch of water in which to plot a course.
All we had to navigate with was a sextant and a depth finder. That was all.
A sextant determines the position of a boat in relation to the sun and stars. A submarine has to surface to be able to use it. But when the Manurv surfaced that day in October, it was spotted by an enemy plane and came under attack.
A chap came up behind me and said, "Lieutenant, there's a fire in the electrics." I dashed down the gangway and saw water coming down. So I went back to the command post. I told them to close all the ballast tanks, and I shouted to the skipper, "We've been hit."
The Manurv could not dive quickly enough. The plane attacked, then returned to drop 4 depth charges. The Manurv's crew thought their number was up, but at the last moment, the pilot realized his error. The plane was not German, but British. It had mistaken the Manurv for an enemy submarine. The whole crew had nearly been killed by friendly fire. Badly damaged, the Manurv managed to limp back to Dundee.
For the poor Manurv, it was the end of the road. She was irreparable. She had dodged the Germans for 3 years before being finished off by a British plane. It's a sad tale.
The legendary submarine was no longer ship-shape.
With the same crew. We then joined a British submarine to end the war on that vessel, always with the same resolve.
In November 1942, the Allies liberated the French territories in North Africa and took control of the ports where much of the Navy which had remained loyal to the Vichy regime was still stationed. After more than 2 years of collaboration, the French commanders switched sides and joined the British. The Free French Naval Forces no longer had any need to exist, since the whole French Navy was now behind de Gaulle.
It has to go, because the whole aim of it is to reinstate France. And as soon as France is back, the Free French Navy has to disappear, because what has to come back is the regular forces of France. So it's a sad moment, but it's also a moment of triumph, because that's what they've all worked for.
General de Gaulle's dogged combat resulted in success. In 1945, France threw off the yoke of the Nazi occupier. The French were on the side of the victors.
When the Germans saw the French arrive at the table for the signing of the surrender in Berlin, they were stunned. For them, the French were not among the victors. The Russians, the British, the Americans, but not the French. So de Gaulle's gamble had paid off. What lay behind the engagement of these men was the will to maintain France's place to the end. France was never defeated.
To start out with nothing, with a band of youths plus a handful of soldiers, and to say, we're going to save France. It's true. To begin with, we said, he's either a genius or a dreamer. But he managed to keep us going. He sent a message to all us fighters. Free Frenchmen, my good companions, tell yourselves that at the end of all our trials, he addressed us, all our pain and suffering. There is the greatest glory in the world, that of men who never gave in.
Today, the Cross of Lorraine still flies over one submarine in the French Navy. The latest version of the Rubis has taken over the name from her illustrious forebear, carrying French colors to the four corners of the world.
I think the greatest legacy we inherited from them was that will, that permanent pugnaciousness to accomplish the mission, to see it through to the end, whatever happens.
The forerunner of the Rubis today lies on the seabed off the coast of Toulon. Unlike other submarines, it wasn't dismantled at the end of its service. It had the honor of being sunk during a special ceremony. Now, divers can visit the wreck and commemorate its history and that of the other valiant submarines of Free France.